Good evening. This is Shormishta welcoming you to Reader's Retreat. Our story for today is Dream by Somerset Maugham. Somerset Maugham, born in 1874, Somerset Maugham was an English novelist, playwright, and a short story writer, and one of the most popular authors of his era. His work reflects his admirable style and an intelligent understanding of human nature. Our story, The Dream by Somerset Maugham. It chanced that in August 1917, the work upon which I was then engaged obliged me to go from New York to Petrograd, and I was instructed for safety's sake to travel by way of Vladivostok. I landed there in the morning and passed an idle day as best I could. The Trans-Siberian train was due to start, so far as I remember, at about 9 in the evening. I dined at the station restaurant by myself. It was crowded, and I shared a small table with a man whose appearance entertained me. He was a Russian, a tall fellow, but amazingly stout, and he had so vast a paunch that he was obliged to sit well away from the table. His hands, small for his size, were covered in rolls of fat. His hair, long, dark, and thin, was brushed carefully across his crown in order to conceal his baldness, and his huge face, with its enormous double chin clean shaven, gave you an impression of indecent nakedness. His nose was small, a funny little button upon that mass of flesh, and his black shining eyes were small too. But he had a large, red and sensual mouth. He was dressed neatly enough in a black suit. It was shabby and looked as if it had been neither pressed nor brushed. The service was bad, and it was almost impossible to attract the attention of a waiter. We soon got into conversation. The Russian spoke good and fluent English. His accent was marked, but not tiresome. He asked me many questions about myself and my plans, my occupation, and I answered with a show of frankness, but with dissimulation. I told him I was a journalist. He asked me whether I wrote fiction, and when I confessed that in my leisure moments I did, he began to talk of the later Russian novelists. He spoke intelligently, and it was plain that he was a man of education. By this time, we had persuaded the waiter to bring us some cabbage soup, and my acquaintance pulled a small bottle of vodka from his pocket, which he invited me to share. I do not know whether it was the vodka or the natural loquaciousness of his race that made him communicative. But presently he told me, unasked, a good deal about himself. He was of noble birth, it appeared, a lawyer by profession, and a radical. Some trouble with the authorities had made it necessary for him to be much abroad, but now he was on his way home. Business had detained him at Vladivostok, but he expected to start for Moscow in a week, and if I went there, he would be charmed to see me. "Are you married?" he asked me. I did not see what business it was of his, but I told him that I was. He sighed a little. "I am a widower," he said. "My wife was a Swiss, a native of Geneva. She was a very cultivated woman. She spoke English, German, and Italian perfectly. French, of course, was her native tongue. Her Russian was much above the average for a foreigner, and she had scarcely the trace of an accent." He called a waiter who was passing with a tray full of dishes and asked him how much longer we were going to wait for the next course. The waiter, with a rapid but presumably reassuring exclamation, hurried on, and my friend sighed. Since the revolution, the waiting in restaurants has become abominable. He lighted his 20th cigarette, and I, looking at my watch, wondered whether I should get a square meal before it was time for me to start. "My wife was a very remarkable woman," he continued. "She taught languages at one of the best schools for the daughters of noblemen in Petrograd. For a good many years we lived together on perfectly friendly terms. She was, however, of a jealous temperament, and unfortunately she loved me to distraction. It was difficult for me to keep a straight face. He was one of the ugliest men I had ever seen. There is sometimes a certain charm in the rubicund and jovial fat man, but this saturnine obesity was repulsive. I do not pretend that I was faithful to her," he said. "She was young when I married her, and we had been married for 10 years. She was small and thin, and she had a bad complexion and a bitter tongue. She was a woman who suffered from a fury of possession, and she could not bear me to be attracted to any one but her. She was jealous not only of the women I knew, but of my friends, my cat, and my books. On one occasion, in my absence, she gave away a coat of mine merely because I liked none of my coats so well. But I am of an equable temperament. I will not deny that she bored me, but I accepted her acrimonious disposition as an act of God, and no more thought of rebelling against it than I would against bad weather or a cold in the head. I denied her accusations as long as it was possible to deny them, and when it was impossible, I shrugged my shoulders and smoked a cigarette. The constant scenes that she made did not very much affect me. I led my own life. Sometimes, indeed, I wondered whether it was passionate love she felt for me or passionate hate. So we might have continued to the end of the chapter if one night a very curious thing had not happened. I was awakened by a piercing scream from my wife. Startled, I asked her what was the matter. She told me that she had a fearful nightmare. She had dreamt that I was trying to kill her. We lived at the top of a large house, and the well round which the stairs climbed was broad. She had dreamt that just as we had arrived at our own floor, I had caught hold of her and attempted to throw her over the balusters. It was 6 stories to the stone floor at the bottom, and it meant certain death. She was shaken I did my best to soothe her, but next morning, and for 2 or 3 days after, she referred to the subject again, and notwithstanding my laughter, I saw that it dwelt in her mind. I could not help thinking of it either, for this dream showed me something that I had never suspected. She thought I hated her. She thought I would gladly be rid of her. She knew, of course, that she was insufferable, and at some time or other the idea had evidently occurred to her that I was capable of murdering her. The thoughts of men are incalculable, and ideas enter our minds that we should be ashamed to confess. Sometimes I had wished that she might run away with a lover, sometimes that a painless and sudden death might give me my freedom. But never, never had the idea come to me that I might deliberately rid myself of an intolerable burden. The dream made an extraordinary impression upon both of us. It frightened my wife, and she became for a little less bitter and more tolerant. But when I walked up the stairs to her apartment, it was impossible for me not to look over the balusters and reflect how easy it would be to do what she had dreamt. The balusters were dangerously low. A quick gesture and the thing was done. It was hard to put the thought out of my mind. Then, some months later, my wife awakened me one night. I was very tired and exasperated. She was white and trembling. She had the dream again. She burst into tears and asked me if I hated her. I swore by all the saints of the Russian calendar that I loved her. At last, she went to sleep again. It was more than I could do. I lay awake. I seemed to see her falling down the well of the stairs, and I heard her shriek and the thud as she struck the stone floor. I could not help shivering. The Russian stopped, and beads of sweat stood on his forehead. He had told the story well and fluently, so that I had listened with attention. There was still some vodka in the bottle. He poured it out and swallowed it at a gulp. "And how did your wife eventually die?" I asked after a pause. He took out a dirty handkerchief and wiped his forehead. By an extraordinary coincidence, she was found late one night at the bottom of the stairs with her neck broken, he said. "Who found her?" I asked. "She was found by one of the lodgers who came in shortly after the catastrophe." "And where were you?" I asked again. I cannot describe the look he gave me of malicious cunning. His little black eyes sparkled. "I was spending the evening with a friend of mine. I did not come in till an hour later. At that moment the waiter brought us the dish of meat that we had ordered, and the Russian fell upon it with good appetite. He shoveled the food into his mouth in enormous mouthfuls. I was taken aback. Had he really been telling me in this hardly veiled manner that he had murdered his wife? That obese and sluggish man did not look like a murderer. I could not believe that he would have had the courage to do that? Or was he making a sardonic joke at my expense? In a few minutes, it was time for me to go and catch my train. I left him, and I have not seen him since. But I have never been able to make up my mind whether he was serious or jesting. That was Dream by Somerset Maugham. This is Shormishta from Reader's Retreat once again. Please subscribe my channel for more stories, updates and notifications. We'll be back with a new story very soon. Until then, thank you and good night.